All right, red light's on. We're good to go. Well, thank you again for joining. My name is Sam Furio. I'm the outreach coordinator for MDE's Building Decarbonization team. I will be moderating this afternoon's session. So thank you for joining the second session of the Alternative Fuels and Technologies Working Group. We're excited to continue this working group for stakeholders for both the Building Energy Performance Standards, aka BEPS, and also the Clean Heat Rules. So if you're seeing some unfamiliar faces or names in the attendee list, that's we've got a couple groups of stakeholders combined here. So appreciate you all joining. As per usual, if you've joined our working group sessions before, this session will be recorded and uploaded to the Maryland Department of the Environment's BEPS YouTube playlist and also the Clean Heat Rules YouTube playlist. We will share a link to the slides from today's session in the description of the video on YouTube after it is posted to those playlists. And also, if you've joined one of our working groups or webinars before, either for BEPS or the Clean Heat Rules, the chat feature is currently disabled. If you have questions, you can submit them in the Q&A feature for Google Meet in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. It used to look like a circle, triangle, square. They changed it. I'm still a bit salty about it. It now looks like 9 dots in a square. So I've got to get used to that change as well. But 9 dots in a square, bottom right-hand corner. You click there and select Q&A, and you can let us know your thoughts and questions that are on your mind. And we'll work to address questions submitted in the Q&A towards the end of the session as time allows. Today we're thrilled to have a special guest presenter for this second session who will be providing information on life cycle assessments as it relates to clean heat policies. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Emily Grubert. Dr. Grubert, camera's working, that's great. If you want to come off mute and say hey.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Real pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you spending some time with me today.
Thanks, Dr. Grubert. Glad mic and camera are working. And Dr. Emily Grubert is an associate professor of sustainable energy policy and concurrently of civil and environmental engineering and earth sciences at the University of Notre Dame. Her research focuses on justice-oriented deep decarbonization and decision support tools for large infrastructure systems. Dr. Grubert holds a PhD in environment and resources from Stanford. So thank you again for being here with us today and looking forward to your presentation. In addition to Dr. Grubert, we have our very own Dr. Zach Brazola, aka Dr. Decarb, joining us today as well. Zach is the section head of the Building Decarbonization team here at MDE, and he just popped on as well.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.
All right. Our bench is set. We're good to go. Without further ado, let's just quickly go back over what the purpose of this working group is. Why are we all gathered here today? If you missed the first session of this working group, this is the same purpose as last time. So the goal of this group is to create a consistent, scientifically based assessment of the life cycle emissions impacts of alternative fuels and technologies to apply to Maryland's building decarbonization policies. And then also this group serves as a space to solicit stakeholder input to inform the development of this framework. So those are the purposes and goals of this group. The agenda for today's session is we're going to run through just a brief recap. Dr. Decarb is going to talk about how the building decarbonization policies fit together. And then we are going to hand it over to Dr. Grubert to talk about clean heat and analytical support for transition policies. We're going to move back into the feedback portion of this working group and introduce new opportunities for feedback, and then move into Q&A for today's session. And again, if you just joined while I was doing the introduction, Q&A can be accessed via the 9 dots in a square in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Click there and hit Q&A. Let us know what you're thinking. So if you require more in-depth details of BEPS, Building Energy Performance Standards, or the Clean Heat rules than what we highlight today, we would point you to previous webinars and technical documentation that is currently available viewing on the department's BEPS website and also the Clean Heat rules website and also their YouTube playlists. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Decarb to talk about these decarbonization policies for the state. Take it away, Zach.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks again for joining us. We talked about this a little bit last time, but just want to kind of step back and talk about this one more time because I think it's really important to help frame the conversation we're having today. We're working on several different building decarbonization policies at MDE, and as well in the background is the Empower Maryland program as well. That's run a ratepayer funded program run by the utilities. And so the goal is that Empower really is reducing electricity and now fossil fuel use in most buildings across the state, but it excludes some small utilities as well as delivered fuel providers. And that kind of is a background happening in all of this. And so when we are looking at some of our programs, we want to make sure that we're aligning with a lot of the work happening already in Empower and leveraging that to kind of further grow the impacts through these programs. And then Clean Heat Standard, or CHS, that's one of the major clean heat rules that we're talking about. The whole goal of CHS is to reduce fossil fuel use in all buildings. But as we're talking about today, it can also replace that with clean heat options. And those include, we had a slide last time, I won't go over it too far again today, but talking about things like weatherization and air sealing, doing building envelope work to reduce the energy use and therefore emissions. Installing zero emissions appliance equipment, such as solar heating, all electric equipment, heat pumps, things of that nature, as well as the delivery of alternative fuels that are potentially have reduced emissions compared to a standard fuel. And it's on that latter piece that we're really focused on today in this working group that we're running right now. And that also overlaps with the Building Energy Performance Standards, which is focused on buildings 35,000 square feet and larger in the state. And that program is really kind of has multiple hats and multiple goals, but biofuels are part of that program as well. And we're working on the accounting methods to actually make that get incorporated properly into the Building Energy Performance Standards, because if you're coming from BEPS world, you may or may not know, but Energy Star Portfolio Manager does not account for really any other fuels besides the standard fuels available, fossil fuels available on the market today. And so we're doing part of this working group is to look at that accounting that we might be able to incorporate into BEPS down the line. And then we're also working on this policy around the heating equipment standards, focused on small heating equipment in mostly residential scale buildings and some small commercial. And so taken together, this is intended to cover the building sector in Maryland and help us as we work to meet our climate and air quality and health goals for the state. So that's kind of the big picture here, but we're talking today, this working group really is crossing across many of these different policies. And so trying to really discuss and build together a framework to actually do these analyses in multiple policies down the road. And so with that, I'm going to actually stop our screen sharing and hand it over to Dr. Krubert.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and again, really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you all today. I'm going to talk a little bit about life cycle assessment just as a method for thinking about what transitions might look like in the decarbonization space, but then really bring that more specifically into some of the clean heat work that's going on in a lot of different parts of the country. So I'll kind of amend my bio to say that I spend a lot of time working on transition pathways. So specifically how you move away from fossil fuel use in a way that preserves people's safety, continuity of services and things like that, but also gets you durable decarbonization. As part of that, I work quite a bit on heat and renewable natural gas in particular, and so I'll bring some of those examples today. But I'll try to make plenty of space for questions and really look forward to our conversation. So Let me just start out by talking about the point that I'm going to be bringing up life cycle assessment largely as an analytical method that often gets used when we talk about decarbonization and transition policies. Maybe one of my points today is to kind of bring to you what LCA is good at, and then what LCA gets used for that's not necessarily within its original design space, and then leads us to some sort of strange outcomes on the policy front. And maybe the real headline here is, I would argue that life cycle assessment is incredibly valuable for determining good pathways to decarbonization. When LCA and other similar methods are used to sort of identify instantaneous changes, you can end up in some sort of strange places where basically you end up spending quite a lot of money on something that maybe reduces emissions instantaneously, but doesn't give you the investment in the long-term infrastructure that's going to actually get you to some of your long-term goals. So that's kind of the teaser here. So to start out just by explaining LCA, I imagine many of you are probably somewhat familiar with this, but I'm a life cycle assessment methodologist, and so I tend to have a pretty specific view of what this is. So I figure it's probably worth spending a little bit of time defining to you how I think about what LCA is and what I'm talking about when I say this. But basically, the way that I see life cycle assessment, this is sort of borne out by the ISO standards that govern the methodological framework here, is that this is a multi-criteria decision support tool, where the whole idea basically is to try to generate prospective information about something generally that you haven't done yet, looking at the different kinds of impacts that might affect a decision that you're trying to make across a wide variety of criteria that matter and affect basically your sustainability. So I teach life cycle assessment. One of the things I tell my class all the time is that LCA is a decision support tool, not a calculator. When we use it for carbon accounting primarily, it ends up being a little bit deployed as a calculator in some ways that, again, I'll explain, can be a little bit counterproductive at times. But in general, when LCA is really being used at its best, what it's trying to do is look comprehensively at the entire life cycle of whatever it is that you're analyzing. Historically, that's been a product. It's kind of expanded to a product, process, system, service, or policy, depending on how excited you want to be about getting this method really going. But the idea for that life cycle is to look at the material recovery processes all the way through return of those materials to the environmental system. So production through disposal, people will sometimes call this cradle to grave, sometimes cradle to cradle if you're looking at some of the circular economy kinds of conversations. But the reason why this is so powerful, even in its maybe less decision support oriented applications, is because it really does force you to look at emissions that happen across a bunch of different processes that are associated with delivering something at the end. So rather than just looking at the emissions from using natural gas for heat, for example, this actually also demands that you look at things like methane emissions associated with production and pipeline transportation, things like that. So the fact that it allows you to see what the full burden of environmental impacts are from doing something, whatever it is that you're actually trying to do, in this case, we're mostly talking about heating, that allows you to really get a fuller picture of what it is that you're committing to when you engage in a particular application. The thing about this that often gets left out when people are using life cycle analysis methods or life cycle thinking methods that aren't really this formal life cycle assessment ISO governed thing is that we don't always look at all of the different outcomes that matter for a decision. Fundamentally, though, what LCA is designed for is to try to detect all the kinds of outcomes that might be relevant for what you care about when you're looking at an environmental system that typically is things like climate change, but also smog, water pollution, toxicity, habitat, many other things that we see as being pretty common typically as you think about what kinds of environmental impacts you might want to try to avoid. So the idea is you look at all of those criteria across all of these different life cycle stages and try to get a pretty comprehensive picture of what's going on. So fundamentally, as a decision support tool, what makes LCA so powerful, particularly in contrast to a lot of other methods that are out there, is that you're really looking for opportunities to identify what we call burden shifting, basically moving an impact from one area to another, whether that's a different place in the process, so burden shifting across the life cycle, or burden shifting across different environmental compartments is sort of the LCA terminology here, where maybe you are vastly increasing water pollution in exchange for a lower impact on the climate climate change front or something along those lines. But the idea basically is to set up a situation where you're able to spot where those burden shifts are happening and then compare alternative decisions that you might be making with the intent of choosing the one that is least burdensome, but also maybe being able to design a system that's actually better at avoiding some of those major impacts and maybe looking for opportunities to reduce them. So this is the what LCA is really good at, is this burden shifting analysis and generally prospective evaluation. What LCA is used for, but is not necessarily what it is fundamentally designed for, is a lot of the time sort of compliance-based estimating functions. So essentially saying you have to do a life cycle analysis in order to determine precisely what your greenhouse gas intensity of something might be retrospectively. LCA generally is an incredibly data-intensive method, and so one of the issues that we see quite a lot when it gets used in this way for compliance or for tax credit purposes or something along those lines is that the level of certainty that you have about the numbers that you're getting out are extraordinarily dependent on your inputs. When you're using LCA as this decision support tool, generally that's not as much of a problem because you're really trying to do something comparative. And so if you have two different options that you're thinking about and you've got some challenges with your underlying data that apply to both of those, you care more about the relative impact than the absolute impact. When instead we use this as a retrospective calculation tool that is trying to look at what did happen rather than what could happen and where we could change things, you tend to get into situations where you actually care a lot more about the absolute value. And that's why sometimes LCA kind of gets a little bit of a bad reputation as not being as rigorous at giving you the precise number as it could be. It's not really an LCA problem, it's more of an underlying data problem, but it's something that has been sort of associated with life cycle analysis a lot of the time because of that challenge in getting really, really good data. That doesn't mean it can't be used, but just kind of introducing, like, this is something that was not really designed as a calculator, but often gets used that way. And so that is a little bit challenging in the clean heat setting. What I'm going to maybe propose to you is there are ways where LCA actually turns out to be incredibly important for thinking about what clean heat policies might look like that are not necessarily the ones that people generally expect. So to kind of just really put a fine point on that, life cycle assessment as such is a formalized decision support framework rather than a calculator. And so when people, I think, get a little bit nervous about outputs, usually the problem is with the underlying data, not the decision support framework itself. The issue a lot of the time is how we collect data, particularly around things that aren't necessarily well tracked. Methane is a really good example of this and comes up a lot in the heating context where, you know, we're quite good at estimating how much CO2 is emitted when you burn natural gas. It's a stoichiometric chemical process. We know if you have an efficient combustion process, how much of that carbon is going to be converted into carbon dioxide to really high specificity. And we know how much gas we're burning because people pay for it and track it very closely. Methane that's leaking along the life cycle of that gas is much, much harder to track. And so that, though it is really important for evaluating what the greenhouse gas emissions of something are in a life cycle framework, is actually a really challenging data problem and is part of the reason why this tends to give you answers that may look quite different from each other. So that I think in the back of your head, thinking about LCA as a decision support framework that's very dependent on its input data, not a calculator, probably explains sometimes why you might have two people both saying, I did an LCA and I got vastly different answers. It's usually a data problem in the back of it. So LCA, capital LCA lifecycle assessment is what we generally use to refer to the framework governed by the ISO 14040 series. This is the one that looks across all lifecycle stages, across all types of impact criteria. That's distinct from what you'll see people talking about when we say lifecycle analysis or lifecycle thinking, which tends to be more just things that are looking at one impact across its whole life cycle. So related, but it is a little bit different when you start talking about formal LCA. With formal LCA, there are actually specific steps, approaches, and methods that you need to use, largely oriented around making sure that your analysis is complete, both in terms of that life cycle and all of those criteria that you care about. That's hard to do, but that's kind of the target here. One of the other things that I think comes up that's pretty important here is life cycle assessment is a fundamentally quantitative method. It's also a really, really data intensive one. At the base of it, it's basically a bunch of matrix math. And so it's usually performed using softwares. Sometimes we do this in Excel because it's at the end of the day, it's basically an accounting thing, just that we happen to be looking at more than just money, which makes it much denser than a typical monetary accounting software. But there are also specialized softwares that are focused on LCA. That software, though, is like Excel in the sense that it gives you a framework for performing calculations. It doesn't actually include the values. And so if you're thinking about LCA, just I think remembering that it is the thing that helps you calculate things when you have data to put into it, not the data itself. That again explains, I think, sometimes why we see pretty different answers depending on what underlying data people are using. And yeah, one of the things I always want to emphasize is this less formal life cycle analysis that's just like carbon accounting or something like that can still be really valuable. But I think it's relevant to recognize when you're doing formal LCA and when you're not. So this point that LCA is really data intensive, again, points to the fact that many people use software to do this. So this image is one that comes out of a pretty common software called SEMA Pro, but there are many others. The other thing that I think comes up here a lot is that it's pretty common to use standardized data that are formatted in ways that these softwares are able to use. So much the same way that you might be able to pull like a CSV into Excel, there are other data formats that we use with databases that are really designed to be used with LCA software. And so that is sometimes why you will see people talking about LCA data or something along those lines. The problem with standardized data is they're generally not super applicable to the specific thing that you're investigating. And because LCA is really, really specific, a lot of the time, if you're really doing a formal LCA or asking a company to do one, they'll want to be getting data that are specific to, you know, their wells, their processing plants, their specific pipelines and things like that. So you do end up generally seeing quite a bit of new data that aren't necessarily harmonized with everything else that people might be using. That's not always a bad thing, right? Like if you're using data that are actually correct for your particular process and therefore getting a different answer from other people, that's appropriate and basically what this is good for. If you are using data that just haven't been vetted, that kind of thing, it's actually kind of hard to tell the difference between a situation where you're using really, really high quality data and really low quality data and why you're getting a different answer than somebody else might be. So this all kind of leads up just to the point that I think many of you are probably familiar with the GREET model, which is basically an Excel-based combination life cycle evaluation model and database. So GREET basically seeks to evaluate the greenhouse gas emissions and then a couple of other impacts. So water intensity is one that they've delved into a little bit, originally associated with alternative transportation fuels. And that's kind of expanded to a lot of other areas because many of those alternative transportation fuels are also alternative fuels for other processes. So things like RNG, hydrogen, clean electricity, those types of things are pretty well represented in GREET at this point. But GREET, kind of contrary to a lot of these other softwares, is, again, it's an Excel-based system, but it also is one that includes a lot of data that has basically been refined over many years by the folks at Argonne National Lab. Part of the reason why I'm kind of dwelling on this is because GREET oftentimes gets brought into both federal and state level policy processes that demand or can benefit from some use of life cycle analysis in carbon contexts in particular. Because of that, there tends to be a bit of a perception that the GREET numbers are absolutely representative for the United States. In some cases, they are very much close enough and get used that way. But I think it's also relevant to know that GREET oftentimes does get kind of adapted to the context that it's actually being used in, where people do change some of the inputs to reflect the particular context that they're in or reflect like a particular future policy context. So things like how much do you assume methane is leaking out of a natural gas pipeline system? That's not necessarily a static number, and it shouldn't necessarily be a static number. So when people talk about GREET results, those are not necessarily always going to be identical for something that you're evaluating, because there is the opportunity to change out the data to reflect what you believe is going on in your particular context. So it is authoritative in the sense that it was designed for the United States. It's why widely used, and the structures that are inside of there are oftentimes deployed in a lot of American contexts to make sure that people are at least vaguely making the same kinds of assumptions, and particularly that they're making the same kinds of assumptions about which processes are included. But the data inside of GREET are not necessarily static. You can change them. There are sometimes political choices that get made that affect what your numbers in there might be. I'm not actually meaning that in a pejorative sense. So one of the things that comes up quite frequently is that it is actually a value choice, and therefore one that's governed by generally political processes to determine, what time basis do you care about greenhouse gas emissions occurring over. So people may be familiar with the fact that New York actually requires people to evaluate methane emissions on a 20-year basis. Pretty much the rest of the country evaluates it on a 100-year basis. Again, value choice, political choice. There are good scientific reasons to choose either one of them, but including choices like that into GREET is actually pretty straightforward, and is part of the reason why you are going to tend to get different results depending on the context that you're working within. So if you're using GREET, you can change the numbers, but it's often kind of used as a specific US energy-focused, generally carbon accounting tool that helps you think about alternative fuels. One of the other things that I want to talk about with regard to LCA before kind of getting into the specifics about how this applies to clean heat is just that the model framework is actually fundamentally based on marginal and incremental estimates in a way that can actually affect the way that you do policy analysis in ways that aren't necessarily super visible. This is one of these things that you just need to decide when you're making a model. So it's not to say that this is a wrong way to do it, but I think it is relevant to understand when you're thinking about how people are actually using LCA. Basically, the idea within a life cycle assessment is that the incremental environmental impact from doing something happens linearly based on how much of something that you're made. So it's maybe useful to understand that life cycle assessment was kind of widely considered to have been first developed to evaluate Coca-Cola's choice of using plastic bottles or glass bottles for transporting the soda that they were manufacturing. So the idea was, let's actually try to see what the trade-offs are between, heavier manufacturing costs for glass versus some of the transportation benefits or waste issues that show up when you use glass versus plastic, and just really trying to get into a whole bunch of different environmental impacts based on that individual productized thing. So the design has been around, like, what is the impact per bottle? What is the impact per, unit of concrete that you're manufacturing, or something along those lines. Because of that, when you have nonlinearities, or when you have really big capital investments of environmental impact, such as, if you're building a really large facility that has a lot of embodied carbon in it that's not necessarily really well tied to a bunch of individual units of output, it can be a little hard to determine what's going on. Side note, the Coca-Cola thing is always kind of interesting, because using this first proto life cycle assessment, they actually determined that glass bottles would be more environmentally friendly, and then decided to go with plastic anyway. So also a reminder that this is a decision support tool, not a decision making tool. But I think that history of life cycle assessment as a product-based evaluation tool that's been expanded to think about products, processes, services, systems, and policies really helps explain where sometimes it tends to break down. And maybe what I would argue here is that one of those places is when you're on a decarbonization trajectory that requires you to incrementally reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you may see that some applications of life cycle assessment will point you to things that maybe get you that incremental difference, but don't necessarily put you on an infrastructural pathway to your final goal. I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. But here, I think for those of you that are, like me, civil engineers, you maybe are familiar with this kind of language, but essentially within life cycle assessment, you break things out into what we call unit processes, which are basically ways of tracking each individual process that goes into a life cycle. So, truck transport of 10 kilometers or something like that might be a unit process. But the idea, and where this comes into this marginal and incremental estimate point, is that basically you see this showing up as a quantity estimate that basically looks a lot like you might see with project costing, life cycle costing, for those of you that are familiar with that. But the reason why this ends up looking a lot like a bunch of matrices is basically because you're saying, okay, for each process that I'm doing, I have a number of times that I do that process, and I have an impact that I experience per process in a bunch of different categories, and multiplying those together gives me the total impact. So it's linear. Basically, if I make one more bottle, I get one more unit of impact. And it is something that is fundamentally assuming that you are making more of something. There's not sort of one individual process. Why this shows up in the heat context is basically because you're going to tend to see this applied like per unit of heat that's actually administered inside of a building or something like that, rather than looking at maybe the overall potential for a transition from a natural gas system to a non-natural gas system or something along those lines. This is correctable when you're looking for it, but it's a fundamental element of this method. The other thing here that's maybe useful to know is that because of that, data generation for life cycle assessment purposes usually focuses on unit processes. So when people spend time trying to derive a bunch of data that might be usable in an LCA context, it's usually a per unit type of thing. So what is the CO2 intensity per unit of hydrogen? What is the CO2 intensity per unit of electricity? Something along those lines. And you don't necessarily see a lot of data focus on, again, these more embodied processes. So where does that show up? Basically, if you have a situation where you're expecting a lot of dynamism in your system, you have to be pretty careful about good scenario design, because for something like decarbonization, where you actually do expect a particular input to be changing over time. So if I'm looking at a building, for example, and I know that as part of my life cycle, that building is going to be demanding a certain amount of electricity every year, and I also know that the electricity system is getting cleaner over time, if I fail to account for that in the way that I'm designing my scenario and in the way that I'm designing some of my data collection, I'm going to end up with a pretty significant overestimate of the potential environmental benefits potentially of actually doing something like electrification. So basically, if I have a system that says for 20 years, I'm going to be using 12,000 kilowatt hours of electricity in my house, and based on the impact of electricity in my grid area right now, which I'm in Indiana, we're still about 50% coal here, I'm going to end up saying something that basically says electricity is going to give me a pretty high greenhouse gas burden over time, because I'm assuming that every single year I'm applying this, 1 pound of CO2 per kilowatt hour factor that maybe currently applies. But if I'm in a situation where I expect the grid to get cleaner, I need to account for that in ways that are sometimes a little bit tricky to do if you're not thinking about this from a scenario perspective. So knowing that LCA is based on these kind of quantity times impact types of methods is really, really helpful for identifying where you need to pay a little bit more attention to your underlying data structures. Basically, in this case, what that looks like is a lot like net present value types of calculations, where you just acknowledge that basically $1 now is not the same thing as $1 5 years from now. That's actually a different unit. Similarly here, a kilowatt hour now is not the same as a kilowatt hour 5 years from now. And so I actually need to adjust my my impact based on the actual unit that I'm dealing with, which is a future kilowatt hour versus a present kilowatt hour. That's me talking probably way too fast, but I think for understanding why LCA sometimes can be quite different depending on who's doing it, recognizing that there's a lot of scenario analysis that goes into this, and that generally is designed to be as implemented as part of a decision support context where you're actually really talking with a lot of stakeholders and trying to figure out what they need to understand, I think is instructive to recognize, again, why you will sometimes see people coming up with pretty different answers. It's not because the LCA method is not working. It's generally because there are some judgments being made and some data inputs being chosen that are different based on different analysts. Okay, so how does this apply to heat? I think this is a really, really interesting context to be thinking about LCA and also thinking about decarbonization. As we know, heat is really pretty life critical, particularly in colder places where we tend to see situations where, if you're out of heat for even a day, you might die. In that context, really trying to understand what is it that we can do to decarbonize these systems in a way that's safe and make sure that people actually have access to the service when they need it is actually really, really critical. And so thinking carefully about clean heat in that context of this is a life safety thing, but it's also something where we really need quite a lot of attention to the environmental profile of the inputs that we're using. I think really elevates this as a conversation and makes it important to be very, very careful about life cycle assessment design when that's being used as an input to these policy processes. I like this chart, which was published in the Washington Post a couple of years ago, because it basically just shows you how relevant some of the conversations around fossil to non-fossil switching are. Basically in this graph, the lighter yellow is places that primarily use electricity for heat. You see that mostly in warmer parts of the country. The purples and reds are basically where you're using fossil fuels directly. Generally speaking, either in the colder places or in richer places that have a lot of access to natural gas. And then you see the darker brown, there's some wood in there as well. But the point here, I think, is that in a lot of the places where heat is actually most critical to keeping people alive, those are also the places where we tend to rely on fossil fuels. And there are some good reasons for that, just in terms of energy density and cost and things like this. But it means that when we're talking about clean heat, that transition conversation starts to become really, really relevant as a fossil to non-fossil switch, and thinking about what it is exactly that we're trying to investigate when we think about what that switch might look like. The other reason why this, I think, is really important when we think about life cycle thinking use in policy contexts is because in the areas that are currently using fossil fuels, what we anticipate is probably a pretty wholesale switch of infrastructure being necessary to actually get you to like a zero greenhouse gas input, basically by being able to move to electricity and taking advantage of these zero carbon resources ultimately. What that looks like then is a fundamental shift of the underlying industrial system. So moving away from pipelines, wells, those kinds of things, to transmission lines, heat pumps, like fundamentally different infrastructure. That's not necessarily something that's going to be really obvious when you're looking at this from a marginal per unit perspective, rather than something that's looking at full step changes in terms of the infrastructure that you're deploying. So point being, when you're using life cycle assessment in the context of clean heat, you do need to be pretty careful about what the intended goal is and what some of your scenarios are designed to detect in terms of whether those goals are possible. So to be really explicit, I think the main place where I see this showing up as a problem is when you have targets that basically have interim reduction requirements in places that do probably need an infrastructural step change, you'll end up basically seeing, you know, it's a good idea to invest in natural gas with lower upstream methane leakage or renewable natural gas or something like that incrementally, because it's going to get you to these intermediate targets. Those resources, however, are not actually capable of getting you to that end zero target. And so you are eventually going to need to have a big step change that involves a lot of infrastructure turnover. But if you're not actually requiring your models to show you whether something is capable of reaching the end goal or not, you're going to end up in situations where you potentially spend quite a lot of money on alternative fuels that aren't really capable of getting you to the final goal. So the other thing about this that I think is kind of important to recognize when we start talking about electrification in particular, which kind of gets brought up as the way that you get heat to be able to take advantage of renewable resources that are zero carbon ultimately, is when we think about net zero requirements for the United States, we're talking about a very, very significant expansion of the electricity system. This is a chart that is derived from the EMF 37 study, which was basically a multi-model comparison looking at what it would take to get the United States to net zero emissions by mid-century. And the thing that I'll just call your attention to is that basically it suggests that with not that many frills, like this doesn't account for a lot of the AI data center stuff. This doesn't really account for a lot of hydrogen and carbon removal build out and things like that. Basically, we're talking about a system that needs to go from being about 1 terawatt of installed electricity capacity to somewhere between 5 and 9 terawatts of installed electrical capacity. That's in large part based on how much we're expecting to see heat load, which is simultaneous, non-sheddable in the moment, and generally coincident peak, driving this need to have a lot of electrical capacity available at the same time, generally speaking, also in the winter time when you're going to have pretty low contribution from your solar systems. So basically the point is you need to see a lot of electrical build out very, very quickly in order to make clean heat via electricity plausible. There are a couple of implications of that. One being that you can't actually assume that inefficient electrification deployment is actually going to be plausible, because you do run into just manufacturing and deployment constraints on this electricity. The other is that you may actually start to see pretty different environmental characteristics, even of renewable energies, as you get to these much, much larger scales. But in looking again at clean heat as being something that's mostly about infrastructure investments, I'm not going to go too deep into what these charts actually show, but I wanted to flash them up just in case anyone wants to ask about them after today. This is a study that I did with a PhD student a couple of years ago, Dr. Alex Maxim, who's now working for the Canadian government on some of these kinds of issues, basically suggesting that deep residential building efficiency could probably reduce your peak loading by about half if you do it well. So this kind of view of how much electricity that we need is basically assuming that building efficiency advances at pretty low rates. I think generally most of these models kind of assume a 2 to 3% per year benefit. What we basically showed is that in very cold weather places, actually doing that very high efficiency deployment with really good attention to building envelopes, you could probably cut that peak need by quite a lot in ways that actually do have really, really important implications for the infrastructure that you're deploying. So again, from a policy perspective, you're not necessarily going to see something that's based on, a 5% per year reduction in greenhouse gas requirement, delivering you an answer that basically says you need to switch over all of your systems to electricity, and you also need to do deep residential building efficiency, unless you're very attentive to your scenarios and making sure that you're actually getting to something that's well constrained in the end. But I think to kind of reinforce what Dr. Bozzolo was saying at the beginning, there are a lot of very important reasons to pay quite a bit of attention to efficiency as we start to think about clean heat, and particularly because electrification has the potential to drive grid needs so high that you actually get a huge amount of benefit from paying pretty close attention to these building envelope issues. There's also a safety issue, of course. Like, if you can actually manage to stay safe in a building, even if the power goes out for a day, that's actually a huge benefit from just an overall safety and justice perspective as well. So in my last kind of 5 minutes, and then hopefully we can have some Q&A, what I wanted to talk about quickly, just because we're in the clean heat space, and I think this comes up a lot, I do quite a bit of expert witness work about renewable natural gas because this issue is so prevalent. RNG is a really, really good example of where well done life cycle assessment with really careful scenario development can actually point you to some very important conclusions. But you don't always get there depending on how people are really engaging with these topics. So I'll maybe step through where people tend to talk about RNG and then talk a little bit about some of the scenarios that show you pretty different results necessarily. But basically, renewable natural gas is typically describing biogenic methane. So methane derived from some sort of biological material, usually from something like a landfill or a wastewater treatment plant, that is cleaned up to the point where it's actually capable of being put into a pipeline along with fossil natural gas. The assertion typically by a lot of advocates is that RNG has really, really negative carbon intensity. And so if you use a little bit of RNG with this negative carbon intensity and mix it with fossil gas, you can have a system that on the whole at the end is net zero, or basically whatever carbon intensity that you want, depending on how much renewable natural gas you mix in. It's often used as a justification for basically investing in paying a premium for renewable natural gas as a component of the fuels that people are using in order to meet greenhouse gas targets. What I'm going to kind of step through is basically the assertion that this cannot actually reach the kinds of targets that people are generally talking about, and it tends to be a pretty significant distraction when we start talking about clean heat because of some of the underlying industrial structures that change in response to some of these incentives. So when we're talking about RNG, we're generally talking about a few different sources of things that can get called renewable natural gas. So biogenic waste methane that comes from waste, basically methane that you aren't producing intentionally. It's just sort of happening. And this is pretty common, again, in wastewater treatment plants and landfills. There's also biogenic non-waste methane from waste. So what I'm talking about here is when you're making methane on purpose from waste products. So if I install an anaerobic digester that I didn't have previously at my wastewater treatment plant in order to make more of the carbon in my wastewater actually convert into methane rather than CO2. And then there's non-biogenic, non-waste methane that comes from basically any other source. Sometimes renewable natural gas is talked about as, something that we're making synthetically from captured carbon in the air or something like that. There are a number of different places that you can pull the carbon to potentially make it into methane. But the idea here is essentially that you have some other methane that is being made on purpose. Then this gets kind of funneled through the typical uses of natural gas. So power generation, home and commercial applications, which is usually heating, and then a little bit of cooking as well. And then industrial applications. So, big factories and heat for various industrial applications. And then the counterfactual, which is kind of important, is basically just a description of what you think would have otherwise happened to that methane. So generally speaking, people will talk about trying to evaluate the carbon intensity of renewable natural gas based on assuming potentially it's displacing some other resource. So maybe I'm using RNG instead of natural gas, so I should get some kind of credit for avoiding those emissions. It might be that I'm taking methane and diverting it from a flare where I would have been converting it into CO2, or it may be that I'm taking that methane and diverting it from a vent where it's just reaching the atmosphere directly. Generally speaking, people that are advocating for using a lot of RNG in contexts that are focused on trying to reduce greenhouse gases are basically talking about a very specific pathway where you are taking biogenically derived waste methane, so methane that you would not have produced on purpose, it just sort of happens, that's also being derived from waste, using it in basically any application that you use natural gas for, and then making the claim basically that because it's, first of all, displacing a greenhouse gas intensive resource, typically natural gas, that you are avoiding some amount of CO2 emission, and then also making the assertion that otherwise that methane would have gone to the atmosphere via a vent. So essentially just the methane goes straight to the atmosphere. The claim then is if you take that methane and burn it instead in a way that displaces these greenhouse gas intensive resources, you end up with this highly negative greenhouse gas emission profile associated with using RNG. Because methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2, and because this biological origin of the carbon means that we don't generally count that CO2 as being climate impactful once it's burned, basically the idea is you are taking a waste product that was unavoidable, you are diverting it from reaching the atmosphere directly as a very intensive greenhouse gas, and you're displacing a really greenhouse gas intensive resource. Therefore, this has a really, really high benefit to the climate, and therefore you should assign it negative greenhouse gas emissions. This is the strategy that basically gets you to the point of being able to say, mixing 2 or 3% RNG into a fossil gas could get you to the point of net zero emissions from that fossil system. So you'll often see this in the context of clean heat. Like we don't need to switch over our natural gas systems. We just need to add a little bit of RNG. When you use life cycle assessment in a really more decision support oriented way that really starts to get into the counterfactuals and really digs into some of the underlying industrial structures and how the system is likely to change in response to incentives, what you end up seeing is basically that RNG probably has positive greenhouse gas emissions and probably is lower greenhouse gas intensity than fossil gas, not always, but generally speaking is not actually delivering these incredible climate benefits that you could get in this one particular scenario. And the reason for that is essentially that once you start demanding quite a lot of RNG, a couple of things happen. One is that you start actually making more of it on purpose. So I'm a water resources engineer by training. And like one of the things that we get taught pretty directly is, if you're trying to make more energy available for your wastewater treatment plant or something like that, because they're very energy intensive, you can add an anaerobic digester to make more methane so that you can deploy that at the plant or something along those lines. Similar things apply to landfills, but basically if I have an incentive to have more of my carbon converting into methane rather than CO2, I can do that by just changing some of my processes. That means that any methane that I'm producing in that fashion would not otherwise have existed, but for this incentive. And so any of it that I am diverting from the atmosphere, basically I'm not preventing a massive greenhouse gas emission from happening because that methane wouldn't have otherwise existed. So I should not get credit for diverting this greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. Similarly, you tend to see big incentives for RNG driving the use of other sources. So whether that's synthetic gas or basically fossil origin carbon from a wastewater treatment plant, turning that into methane or something along those lines, you will tend to see people manufacturing methane on purpose, which again means that any emissions to the atmosphere then become climate positive. Basically, you are contributing to climate change if any of those emissions escape. The other thing that we tend to see when you see a bunch of decarbonization processes going on is, first of all, you're generally probably displacing a low greenhouse gas resource by using RNG in a situation where you have high climate policy. So using RNG instead of using electricity for heating, for example. So that avoidance bit of it is actually quite a bit lower than the version of the world where you sort of assume that everybody is going to use fossil gas forever, you're probably actually just competing with other ways of complying with a decarbonization target. The other thing that's maybe even more important, though, is that even for those sources that are truly waste methane, like methane that would have existed regardless of what you're doing, and this is sort of the core claim behind the idea that you can get this very, very negative greenhouse gas intensity methane because it was going to go into the atmosphere anyway. Generally speaking, largely for safety reasons, any capturable methane in that category is going to be flared, so burned and turned into CO2 rather than vented directly as methane, largely because methane can spontaneously combust. And so especially in a situation where you care about greenhouse gas emissions, you are going to, both for safety reasons and for climate reasons, divert as much of that waste methane to a flare as you can rather than just venting it. If you can't divert it to a flare, you can't capture it for use either. And so the idea that you're diverting it from a vent is probably never true. And so at the end of the day, basically, if you really carefully consider the system as it's likely to exist and use this life cycle evaluation to really understand like what would happen in response to this emerging policy, you see that the counterfactuals that are likely to actually be in place are quite different from the ones that lead you to this assumption that you have very, very negative greenhouse gas emissions. So again, probably RNG has lower greenhouse gas emissions than fossil gas, but it's probably not negative, and it's probably actually quite a bit higher than clean electricity at the end of the day. The reason that I bring this up is, first of all, to show like what LCA is really good at, like when you really can start deploying scenarios to understand what's going on, but also to kind of point out that in a clean heat scenario, being pretty attentive to what kinds of resources are likely to get you to your ultimate goal, as opposed to producing marginal benefits that are maybe in line with a slow linear decline in some sort of policy target, can actually lead you to some sort of counterproductive investments at times, where you might be spending a lot of time first converting a system over to one that uses a lot of RNG or a lot of hydrogen, which kind of follows a similar logic, and then needing to ultimately transition to something like electricity or geothermal or something like that at the end of the day anyway. Forcing that two-step transition instead of a one-step transition is pretty common if you're not very careful with your life cycle evaluations. So I'll stop there. Hopefully people have some questions, but also I'm relatively easy to find online, and I'll make sure my email address is available.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Gruber. Really awesome presentation. Thank you for that deep dive into life cycle assessments and applications and scenario development. Really enlightening. With that, I'll move back over to our slide deck and close us out and move into Q&A if there are any questions. So again, thank you for that, Dr. Gruber. Appreciate you being here. So just before we move into Q&A, just wanted to recap the feedback portion of this working group. Again, a critical component of bringing us all here together is soliciting feedback from you all on alternative fuels and technologies listed here on the screen, and then also getting your feedback on other fuels and technologies that should be listed here on the screen. So today we are reopening the feedback form from the session 1 of this working group, which I think we're going to drop here in the chat. Thank you, Cameron. And if you have submitted feedback already from session 1, you don't need to resubmit that same feedback. But if you have new or additional feedback, you can submit that to us for review. And that feedback will inform future sessions of this working group and considerations by MDE. And so just some of the, if you're seeing that form for the first time, some of the questions you'll see in there are, what other technologies should be considered? What should MDE consider as we evaluate these technologies? And if you have supporting documentation, what documentation can you share? And if you do have supporting documentation, you would email that to the Clean Heat team separately, and we'll get you that email on the last slide here. Just real quick, some scheduling for our next meeting. We have blocked out June 2nd at 9 a.m. for the third session of this working group. we'll plan to review feedback and talk next steps for this group moving through 2025. So I expect to see a calendar invite set up for that soon, and opportunities to sign up and take part in that to the email lists shortly. So thank you all for continuing to attend. And with that, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I just want to make sure we get to any questions that were submitted in the Q&A portion. And if you need to contact our teams at all, Clean Heat Rules or BEPS, our contact information is on the screen. And always encourage you to sign up for our email lists. You can get to those by scanning the QR codes on the screen. So let's see what we've got in Q&A. And Dr. Grubert was nice enough to submit her email. So I'm just going to put that in the chat. If you have questions related to her presentation, feel free, if it's okay, to send them to her email there. Again, really awesome slide deck. And so I have one question in the Q&A, and I'll just pitch these to our two doctors here and see what comes of that. But we've got biomethane demand also increases the overall production of livestock, thus increasing more methane release from increased enteric fermentation. Does life cycle analysis or assessment account for this?
Yeah, great question. And this is, I think, one of the fundamental questions about how you do an LCA. So there are two basic kinds of life cycle assessment. One we call attributional life cycle assessment, one we call consequential life cycle assessment. The details are not that important other than to say consequential life cycle assessment attempts to see how the thing that you're analyzing actually changes underlying industrial structures. So a consequential life cycle assessment would account for the fact that the underlying system, in this case livestock production, is changing because of the incentive that you've established. A lot of the time, though, that's actually really hard to do because it has to assume that you have an economic model, and you have to make a lot of assumptions about what that system is going to look like. So people usually use attributional assessments. That's part of the reason why you will tend to see a lot of LCAs not accounting for stuff like that, but one that's well done and actually does account for really what's going on as a response to a policy should account for those kinds of things.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Grubert, and thank you for that question. And that is actually the only question that was submitted in the Q&A for this session. I think you had such a great presentation. Everyone just absolutely loved it. And again, this will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube playlist. So if you want to go back and rewatch, it'll be up there in the coming days. But really appreciate everyone's attendance. And again, thank you, Dr. Grubert, for being here with us today and for presenting that awesome information. And with that, I think I can give you all back 2 more minutes of your day. So appreciate you all being here again. Look for the recording up on YouTube soon, and we'll also get you that invite for the next session as well. So thank you all again for attending, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much.